Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. I'm Sean Gilsdorf. I'm the Administrative Director for the Committee on Medieval Studies here at Harvard. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, which is the third in a year-long series of lectures on Africa in the medieval world, co-sponsored by Medieval Studies, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies, the Department of African American Studies, and the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. Our hope in organizing this program is to revisit the notion of medieval Africa, or perhaps more appropriately, the notion of Africa's relationship with what scholars have dubbed the global Middle Ages, and to continue and extend a set of conversations between scholars of Africa, Byzantium, the Islamic world, and medieval Europe, begun in our 2015 symposium on Trans-Saharan Africa, and continued in last year's Christian Africa Conference. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone of a number of upcoming events that deal directly with the topic of this series. The first of these is hosted by our colleagues in the Medieval History Workshop. There's a talk tomorrow afternoon by Professor Michael Jervers of the University of Toronto, who's here with us tonight. He'll be giving a talk on painting in Ethiopia from the 6th to the 18th centuries. All of you are invited and encouraged to attend Michael's lecture. It'll take place at 4:15 tomorrow in the lower library of Robinson Hall, the History Department building. And a few weeks hence, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies will be welcoming Professor Michael Gomez from New York University, who will deliver this year's W.E.B. Du Bois lectures on the topic of West Africa in the Age of Ascent. These will take place on November 26th, 27th, and 28th. The first and last will be in the Thompson Room here, and the middle will be at the Center for African Studies. You can get more information on that series. There's flyers right by the door if you're interested, which I hope you are. And I now am happy to hand over the podium to my friend and colleague, Suzanne Preston-Blier, Alan Whitehill-Close Professor of Fine Arts and African American Studies here at Harvard, and one of the co-organizers of this lecture series, who will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be given this opportunity to introduce to you Daphne Gallagher. We met at a recent conference at William and Mary that was really one of the most provocative, important, and engaging such symposia I've had the pleasure of attending. In it, the larger question was there a Black Death in West Africa, and bringing together an array of scholars to argue for and against that particular set of issues. And I think, I'm not sure if you can win by way of saying that, yes, there was the Black Death in Africa, but that I think was the conclusion of many of us there. I was struck by Daphne's work, her scholarship, her creative ways of addressing this particular question. She works in Burkina Faso, a part of West Africa, the Savannah area that I know well. And I was particularly struck by how she explored the lacuna of data on villages, how particular settlements simply stopped to exist at a key moment in time, and what one can read within that issue of lack to provide positive insight onto an array of issues in this broader area. Finding the Black Death, which took place in the mid-14th century, of course, is rather difficult. She teaches at the University of Oregon. She has her PhD from University of Michigan, and a wide array of projects and publications under her belt. She runs, in terms of her broader research interests, across an array of different issues within the field of archaeology and anthropology more generally. Not only settlement patterns and the plague, but also is published on a wide variety of questions of paleobotany, and does work on ceramic analyses, landscape, epidemiology, and a wide variety of other things. I'm struck in part by your role in various archaeological excavations with some of the well-known scholars who've worked in the Savannah area, Susan McIntosh, and others, often providing key insights into really the botanical basis for many societies in this region, whether it's looking at shea butter or whether it's addressing larger questions of plants and questions about how states are constructed and the states between states and how that ultimately matters, to say nothing of even toying with questions of archaeology and issues of craft. Well, let me let her get on with this wonderful talk, whose title you can see here, Reflections on Medieval West Africa, Archaeological Perspectives from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you, Suzanne, for that really beautiful and generous introduction. I'd like to start also by thanking the Committee on Medieval Studies, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, the Center for African Studies, and the Department of African and African American Studies for organizing this lecture series and inviting me to participate, and especially to Sean Gilsdorf for all of his work in arranging all the logistics of this visit. Putting together this talk has been a really fun opportunity for me to sort through some of my thoughts on the use of the word medieval in the description of 6th to 7th to 15th century AD West Africa. It's a term and a literature that I've been increasingly engaging with over the past couple of years, but also a word that until recently hadn't really been used for the past couple decades in West African archaeological research. My approach here for this talk is going to be to discuss a little bit about how archaeologists label time in West Africa, with particular attention to the use of the word medieval, and then to explore some of the diversity of societies and research questions in medieval West Africa. I'll be drawing mostly on my own research and that of my collaborators in Mali, Senegal, and Burkina Faso, and I've really tried to structure this talk to touch on a range of different case studies. And so I'm not going to go into super depth on any of them, but I'm happy to go into more during the Q&A. So I'm going to basically argue in this talk that while medieval is a term that has a somewhat fraught history in archaeology related to its early use during the colonial period, it is by no means a term without problems. There are reasons that it's starting to re-enter the West African archaeological literature. However, if, as a field, archaeologists are going to discuss a medieval period in West Africa, we need to do so broadly and not solely in the context of those sites and processes that are most closely intertwined with North Africa and the trans-Saharan trade. So before I get into things, I want to just sort of note that while there have been important gains over the past several decades, West Africa in archaeological research remains really understudied. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of this, this map shows every significant excavation project from the past 30 years in Burkina Faso. This is a country of 100,000 square kilometers. It's about the same size as the state of Oregon. And in the state of Oregon, in 2010 alone, 1 year, the most recent for which there was data, over 120 archaeological excavation permits were issued for work on public lands, right? So over 120 projects in 1 year versus something like this over a period of 30 years. So we're still working with a very limited record. And the low density of archaeological research is not only significant because of the fact that we just don't know as much, we don't have as many case studies, but it also really affects the ways in which archaeologists conduct their analysis and the ways in which we frame our research. Archaeologists in West Africa spend a really significant amount of our time on tasks like baseline chronology building. And our archaeological analysis ends up being fairly localized. We often are dealing with and creating chronologies that apply to only a couple of sites. Now, as Sam mentioned, I'm at the University of Oregon, and at the U of O, we have one of the very few archaeological research groups in the United States, which is focused on the archaeology of medieval West Africa. Together with Stephen Dupin, who is an associate professor of anthropology and director of the laboratory, we direct field research in Burkina Faso, and we also collaborate as zooarchaeological or faunal and paleoethnobotanical analysts on projects from sites throughout West Africa. And we carry out those faunal and botanical analyses in our lab in Eugene. As you can see here, Our research program is strongly focused on the savanna and Sahelian regions of West Africa, and I'm going to touch on most of the labeled sites that you see on this map in my talk today. But, all right, so let's return to this question of chronology. Now, as I mentioned, in West Africa, we have this low density of research, and so we largely lack what I'm going to call the sort of mid-level regional chronologies, things like, say, the Mississippian, or the linear band ceramic, or Shang China. And consequently, when we're doing broader scale archaeological analysis, what tends to end up happening is that we tend to do either site-to-site comparisons that are very localized and very specific, or we tend to go up to really big temporal divisions. And you can kind of see these are 4 different projects within Mali and Burkina Faso, and you can see how the phasing is just totally specific to the site. Even in the inland Niger Delta region of Mali, Jenny Janot and the site of Dia have totally different phasing, which makes comparing these 2 very similar sites really, really difficult. And so the thing is that what ends up happening is that we end up going to those really big macro regional level phases a little bit more often than I think people do in other parts of the world. Now, obviously, no matter where you're working, any kind of big sweeping temporal division across huge areas and hundreds of years is going to be a little bit problematic. But I do think that those kinds of big terms have some utility in that they serve as standardized, broadly understood shorthands for temporal periods under discussion. And also, I'm at heart a little bit of a realist. There have been all kinds of efforts to say, well, we're just not going to call periods of time things. We're just going to refer to years or so on. And that never ends up actually working. And so if we're going to have terms, if we're going to talk about medieval or talk about the Iron Age, we need to think critically about what those terms are and how we're using them. So what are those big divisions that are in use in West Africa? So I've got 3 of the main ones up here at the top. We have prehistory, proto-history, and history. Then this question of perhaps ancient, although ancient hasn't been creeping into West African work in the same way that medieval does. And then also the late Stone Age and Iron Age, which is probably the most commonly used in American archaeology. And you'll notice that on this diagram, I haven't really included the period after about 1450 AD, when you get into various phase names that are usually variations on the Atlantic era, which don't really follow lockstep with the earlier naming protocols, and those talking about that would be sort of a whole different talk. Instead, I'm going to focus here on the terminology for this period from about the 6th to 7th through the 15th centuries. That's where we have medieval phasing in the middle bar. Now, each of these naming protocols has a different underlying logic. Prehistory, protohistory, history is talking about the available sources for reconstructing the past. Iron Age, late Stone Age is talking about technologies in use. And ancient and medieval, at least in the region of Europe and the Mediterranean where the term originated, is talking about sociocultural, political, and economic processes, right? Historical transformations. So, prehistory, protohistory, and history are probably the least used in the English language literature, but are still very common in the Francophone archaeological literature from West Africa. Now, this terminology contains the troubling and oft-critiqued linguistic implication, of course, that there is a time before history. And this has been critiqued by a number of people. I have a quote up there by Acknowledgements, noting the ways in which prehistory has tended to extend longer in particular areas of the world, and that when we're sort of deciding our phases by historical sources, we are inherently privileging certain kinds of historical sources over others, in this case text over, for example, archaeology and oral traditions. And then there's the fact, of course, that on a very functional level, prehistory is really long, right? Prehistory is tens of thousands of years, and there is a broad lack of agreement on the temporality of the transition to history, right? Not to mention the whole question of what even constitutes proto-history. I have yet to see 2 scholars who can fully agree on this. But the people who work within this framework get very specific. I had a professor who is Sorbonne trained who argued with me vociferously that if I would just use the term late proto-history, everyone would know I meant the 12 to 1400s. Everyone, right? Widely accepted that that's late proto-history. Now, we can also look at the technological divisions, right? These have their origins in the three-age system, the current iteration of which originated in the early 1800s in Denmark. And as early as the 1930s, V. Gordon Childe was already expressing how problematic this system was, yet it still has persisted and is still widely in use in Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, among other places. Now, this system privileges, of course, the use of particular technologies, although it doesn't quite work the way it claims to work. Case in point, the West African late Stone Age, which persists until about 3,000 years ago, includes intensive plant management, early use of pottery. Some of the earliest pottery in the world is from West Africa, ground stock technologies, domestic animals, and yet it's somehow still the late Stone Age, right? In doing so, this emphasis on technology ends up highlighting the differential chronologies of technological developments in different places around the world. So on a practical level, this inhibits scientific communication. If you say, oh, well, something is happening in Iron Age West Africa, and you're talking to someone who is more familiar with the archaeological record of Europe or East Asia, they're going to have no idea when the events you're talking about are taking place, and they're going to assume they're happening much earlier. On a more fundamental level, the use of Iron Age then makes West Africa seem late or behind because the Iron Age in West Africa is occurring after the Iron Age in Europe. Now, at the same time, if not for this challenge of the global context and the intellectual histories of the term, and the fact that as we get earlier and earlier dates for iron smelting, the Iron Age is becoming longer and longer, it's now over 2,000 years, I'm not sure iron would necessarily be a terrible technology on which to name a broad term to refer to the first and early second millennia AD in West Africa, because the significance of iron in West Africa, in the archaeological record for this period, really can't be understated. I mean, it has an important economic role in terms of making agricultural tools. However, it also has a deep ritual significance in the process of making the iron, and iron workers have important social roles and often special social roles that set them apart. And this is one of the few things that we see in almost every West African society, whether we're looking at small autonomous village communities or whether we're looking at something like the Empire of Mali, where iron workers play a role in the Epic of Sunjata, right? So in that sense, iron is something that does bind the region over this large period of time. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to shed that global context and the historical evolutionary implications of the term. So this brings us to the question of medieval. Now, medieval's origins as a temporal division are, of course, based in Europe and the greater Mediterranean world, where it refers to the time between classical antiquity and the Renaissance, right? The middle part. And in its historical use in West Africa, the term medieval was originally employed during the colonial era when, as part of a project to recognize the extension of the North African sphere of influence into West Africa, people like, for example, Raymond Money would refer to medieval West Africa. So Raymond Money was one of the major archaeologists, linguist, historian, all around everything kind of amazing scholar working in French West Africa in the 1940s and 50s. And in 1961, he wrote this Tableau géographique de l'Ouest africain au Moyen Âge, a book on medieval West Africa that specifically targeted this phase. And in this book, which really introduced a lot of people to the richness and dynamism of the West African archaeological record, he also explicitly defined his project as exploring a time when West Africa was economically and culturally exclusively dependent on North Africa, right? So consequently, in the 1970s and 80s, a move away from using the term medieval in West Africanist archaeology was also part of a move away from prioritizing the North African influences and the external Arabic sources, and towards prioritizing indigenous African developments and polities. This view of medieval as an imposed label from the outside that is prioritizing North African and European developments over those that are happening within West Africa itself is facilitated by the fact that, as I believe Steve Kaplan discussed in his first talk in this series, medieval in West Africa lacks the same logic unifying the time period that it has in Europe and the Mediterranean, although I know medievalists themselves struggle with the unity of this time. European medievalists, that is. So the end of the medieval era works pretty well in West Africa because a lot of the social processes that define the end of the medieval era in Europe included things like the extension of European oceanic trading systems and colonial projects that affect West Africa as well. But there's also numerous internal developments, such as, for example, the rise of the Songhai Empire, that also occur at around the end of the medieval period. However, the beginning of the medieval period is a little bit more tricky. When we try to chart socially or culturally significant transitions from the 6th to 7th centuries AD, I mean, it's possible to find some things and point to them because if you look hard enough, you're always going to find something. However, there are often things like, oh, we have some very early evidence for the trans-Saharan trade in one place, right? They're not big sweeping social changes that mark regional level transformations in society. And to split the first millennium ignores many of the strong continuities that we see across a multitude of sites that are founded and grow steadily throughout the first millennium. So then the question is, though, why return to medieval, right? If archaeology moved away from medieval, why return to it? And first, I do think that on a purely practical level, there is a public communicative benefit to medieval, since unlike those other broad terms in use I discussed, Iron Age or prehistory, medieval is actually associated with a particular temporal time frame. And so if you talk about Mali and say, oh, it's a medieval empire, people are going to have a general idea of when this empire actually was. Second, I think that employing medieval can be an important tool in combating those old narratives of West Africa as dependent. As discussed in the introduction, medievalists have made a strong effort to expand their studies of the medieval world through symposia, through the founding of new journals, and are, as this lecture series and its preceding conferences emphasize, increasingly interested in understanding how Africa was part of the broader medieval world. Among archaeologists, I think we also have an increasing sense that we need to actively engage in these discussions. However, much of the archaeological literature remains fairly technical and aimed at other archaeologists. And unfortunately, while those of us who work on West African archaeology know a lot about the diverse vibrance of this period, it's still all too often left off the map of the medieval globe. In some cases, literally, as you can see in this map, from Bruce Campbell's, and so this is from Bruce Campbell's recent book, 2016 book, The Great Transition, and I feel a little bit bad picking on him because it's otherwise an excellent book, really interesting, really well done. However, this map really does demonstrate the ways in which those medieval West African trade networks are often just kind of left out, right? West Africa is a great place to put your key. So, one way that archaeologists can participate and bring our work to the attention of medievalists in other regions is by talking explicitly about medieval West Africa, right? In this day of Google Scholar, using these kinds of common terminologies makes a difference. And currently, this almost always occurs in Africanist archaeology, West Africanist archaeology, in the context of sites or finds that are directly related to the medieval world more broadly, in highlighting the Africanist contributions to trade networks that are missing from this map. So take, for example, one site that I've done botanical work at, which is the site of Djiboy. Djiboy was excavated by Cameron Goki at Appalachian State University. We're doing the faunal and the botanical analyses at the University of Oregon. It's located in eastern Senegal near the critical Bambouk gold sources, which supplied much of the medieval gold trade from West Africa. And it was occupied from about 1000 to 1300 AD, which means that it sort of overlaps the end of the Empire of Ghana and the beginnings of the Empire of Mali. And it's likely affiliated into those networks in some way. It has a lot, for a site of its size, it has a large number of North African trade goods. However, one of the most interesting finds from the site of Djiboy has actually occurred in the faunal analyses, which have documented large-scale hunting for the production of animal products. These include hunting of animals for leather production, medium bovids, that's things like reedbucks and bushbucks. They are hunting hippos and elephants and warthogs. I mean, you don't hunt a hippo just casually, right? It's a very dangerous animal to hunt. They also are hunting animals for skins. They're hunting crocodiles. They're hunting leopard. There's more evidence for leopard hunting at the site of Djiboy than at all other sites in West Africa pretty much combined. And they've only done a very small sample of the fauna so far. And so what we have here is we have a site where there is intensive production of animal products. And it's at levels that are well above needed for local consumption at this small village site. And it's also really out of line with the hunting practices that we see at other sites of this time in West Africa. No one else is hunting hippos. No one else is hunting the medium bovids in such high disproportionate numbers. No one else is hunting leopards in the same way. And so in using, now we don't know necessarily, these are definitely for export, whether they're for export within West Africa to feed networks within the Empire of Mali and Ghana, or whether this is for export to North Africa, right, to European ivories, to the leather that's being used, Moroccan leather, right? We're not really sure yet. However, in using the term medieval, the authors are drawing attention to an understudied trans-Saharan trade commodity that's newly visible in the archaeological record at this remarkable site. Similarly, to build on Suzanne's introduction, we're using the term medieval in exploring whether second pandemic's plague spread to West Africa. And there's actually, out of the conference that Suzanne mentioned, we have a forthcoming special issue of the journal Afrique that's edited by Gerard Chouen, who organized this amazing conference and brought us all together. And it also has contributions by Marie-Laure Durat and Monica Green. And we really have this increasing recognition that as our understandings of second pandemic plague ecology and transmission are evolving, the assumption that the disease did not spread south of the Sahara needs to be revisited. While there is, as of yet, no smoking gun in the form of identification of the plague bacterium in West African human remains, although there are multiple projects that are very, very actively looking for it, we are compiling, as Suzanne noted, increasing circumstantial evidence. And my contribution, along with Stephen Dupin's, was to examine several case studies of settlement abandonment and site size reduction in the late 14th and early 15th centuries AD. Now, while our results are not conclusive on their own, since dating abandonment of archaeological sites is incredibly difficult, and it's also very difficult to ever attribute to any one factor, our results are decisively not inconsistent with plague epidemics. In the sense that there's nothing that you could very easily construct a narrative where plague affects, because we see these abandonments, and we don't have anything that suggests that plague is not occurring. So hopefully more to come soon. Now, as I mentioned, many archaeologists working in Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso don't use the term medieval, and the term is conspicuously absent in the publication of archaeological work at several sites that are featured very prominently in the Arabic external sources. Although it's important to note that archaeology has really transformed the stories of these locations. So taking, for example, the cities of Gao and Geni-Geno, two locations where I'm collaborating as a paleoethnobotanist. Now, the archaeology of these two sites, both of which are commonly Arabic external sources as big medieval West African trading centers, is produced remarkably different results. So first off, Gao. Gao is frequently mentioned as the site of Kaka, and recent work by Mamadou Cissé and Takazawa, building on earlier work by Insol and Flight, has firmly established the importance of the early trans-Saharan trade networks for the eastern Niger Bend, and documented monumental structures containing concentrations of trade wealth of glass, of copper, of beads. In contrast, though, it's not purely a story about those external influences. My botanical work at the site has identified largely and almost exclusively crops of West African origin: rice, pearl millet, melons, wild tree fruits. And in this sense, Gao looks really different than, say, for example, the Saharan oasis town of Esuk Mecca, which I believe Sam Nixon will be coming to talk about to you all next term. At Esuk Mecca, they have really large paleoethnobotanical assemblages of wheat. They have the North African crop complex being brought into that location, and that's not something we see at Gao. Now, despite these links, these strong links to the medieval Mediterranean world, in his discussions of Gao, Cisse pretty much never uses the term medieval, and if he does, he's always careful to put it into quotes. Now, we can contrast Gao with Jenny Janot, where many seasons of research at the site have identified neither the high densities of North African trade goods nor the monumental architecture that's been excavated at Gao. Work at the site was pioneering in establishing the fact that the urbanism in the inland Niger Delta predated the development of the trans-Saharan trade, and incredibly intriguing in the lack of material evidence for wealth differentials across this large and densely occupied urban complex. And I was actually an undergraduate at Rice University with Susan and Rod McIntosh, which is how the interesting nature of Jenny Janot is part of what pulled me into West African archaeology. I'm currently just starting analysis on the botanical samples from the 1990s excavations at Jenny Janot and at several neighboring sites in the complex. But one thing that's been interesting is that to date, in the earlier botanical samples from the 1981 excavations, there was no evidence of agricultural intensification despite huge population growth and urbanization. And so it's something we're going to be looking at to see if that's something that bears out, and that could help us understand some of the dynamics at the site and its roles in larger political and economic contexts. Like Cisse, the Macintoshes have for the most part avoided and at times actively critiqued the use of the term medieval because of its colonial association with the subordination of West African cultural developments to those in the Mediterranean, preferring instead to emphasize the local elements of the archaeology of the site, the early occurrence of urbanism, the important localized exchange networks that provided the site with iron and stone, and the site's potential role as a regional supplier of dried fish, smoked fish, and potentially rice, and the effects of the physical and social distance created by its settlement cluster structure, in which you have spatial distance among different parts of the site. Now, I'm deeply sympathetic to these perspectives on whether or not we should be, that the scholars that say, well, maybe we shouldn't be using the term medieval. And I think one can legitimately question whether we need to or should need to adopt the term medieval for West Africa to fully participate in broader historical debates. On the flip side, I think one of the challenges is that by not using the term medieval more broadly, the term medieval is then being left to those sites and those case studies that are most actively linked to North Africa and to the trans-Saharan trade, be that through active use of the term medieval by archaeologists or simply by the fact that it's an inescapable legacy for those sites that are commonly integrated into the external Arabic sources. Now, for the rest of my time, I want to briefly discuss two projects that I'm currently working on in Burkina Faso, both of which are focused on sites and regions for which we not only have minimal evidence of participation in trans-Saharan trade networks, but which also lie well outside the purview of the Sudanic states and exemplify the diversity of the West African archaeological record, Curie Congo and the Madaga Archaeological Survey. So Curie Congo is located in western Burkina Faso in the Mahun-Ben region, and it's located in an area that is historically known for its autonomous communities and its rejection of state control. In the 1920s, people in this region actually effectively threw the French out of the region for a period of about 4 or 5 years, one of the largest anti-colonial rebellions in West Africa. Insofar as we can tell, this region was never incorporated into the territories of either the Sudanic states like Mali or Ghana or Songhai, or the Voltaic states like Masi or Comanche. And at least during the medieval period, we don't have any evidence for real trade goods at the site very much. The site itself is composed of 13 small tells spread over a 33-hectare area, and the community was occupied for over 1,500 years, during which time it grew from a single household to a large community of several hundred people. And I've participated in fieldwork directed at the site since its inception, and I've co-authored several of the more recent publications on the site. And here you can see one of our tells. A road very conveniently goes right through the middle of the site, which has enabled us to fully record the stratigraphies of these tells. And Curie Congo is a really remarkable site. It has incredible preservation of in situ houses, one on top of the other. So Curie Congo was founded in the early first millennium AD as a single generalized household. It grew slowly throughout its first several hundred years of existence, with individual households budding off, each of which were also generalized. However, beginning around 700 AD, the site began to change as the founding household consolidated power. Whereas previously, all the households had been largely self-sufficient. They did their own farming, they did their own hunting, they smelted their own iron, they made their own pottery. The founding household began to co-opt the sources of wealth. They co-opted cattle. Prior to 700 AD, every household has cattle. After 700 AD, only Mound 4, the founding household, has access to cattle. The other households stop smelting and working their own iron, and iron smelting and working also becomes concentrated at Mound 4. They also, you can see the shaded mound there, 3. Mound 3 is actually opened as a cemetery that is exclusively used by the dead of Mound 4. And so you have this whole sort of consolidation of different sources of power and wealth in this founding household. Now, this is a pretty classic story that we see a lot in archaeology. However, around 1150 AD, the community of Curie Congo undergoes a dramatic transformation. It restores an egalitarian political organization that is characterized by separation of powers, by systems of checks and balances, and by the institution of cross-cutting activities that build community unity. Ironworking is taken away from that founding household and is moved to a new household on the edge of the community, where it's combined with newly specialized pottery production. In the earlier phases, households had continued to make their own pottery. Now everyone in the community is using the same pottery, and iron smelting has been separated from the founding house. Cattle herding ceases. Cattle had been kept at Curie Congo since its inception, and even though the local environment gets better for cattle, they stop keeping it, right? So they get rid of their inheritable form of wealth. They close the cemetery, and the burial practices changed. During the cemetery period, other houses had been burying under house floors. Now the burial practices changed. We don't know what the new burial practice is, but it is probably something more communal. And we also see these new collective practices like large group hunts that would have been done by large parts of the community all at once. Dupin has argued that in this political change, what we see is we see the active foundation and construction of many of the egalitarian practices and social systems that persist in the region today, right? That when we see more egalitarian or democratic systems of government in, say, for example, Europe, we say, oh, look, it's like a consciously constructed democracy. And when we see a complex egalitarian political system in West Africa, the tendency in the past has been to say, like, oh, that's a really old political system in a place that never developed inequality. And at Curie Congo, we have evidence that they actively created this egalitarian political structure in the 1150s. Curie Congo continued to thrive until the late 1300s, when it rapidly shrank to half of its peak size, a change which may be attributable to plague. And we have some of the best settlement evidence for plague at Curie Congo, in part because the sequence is so tightly dated, such that we know that we have this large population loss between 1350 and 1400 AD. In the new, smaller, post-1400 AD community, We see new specialist activities, such as intensive leather production, and we also see the first indications in the ceramic styles of influence of Mali. We haven't finished the analyses of some of the later phase of the last phase of occupation, phase 5. However, in that last phase of occupation, is when we do think that we do see some traders from Mali coming and settling at the site of Curie Congo, and we get the creation of a multi-religious community where you have both Islamic and non-Islamic people living together. So, also, stay tuned. All right. So, the Manag Archaeological Survey is sort of a real contrast to Curie Congo. The archaeological landscape of southeastern Burkina Faso, where I directed this fieldwork, is a stark contrast to the layered, well-preserved tells of Curie Congo. For at least the last several hundred years, the oral historical timelines are a little bit murky. Central and eastern Burkina Faso have been ruled by the Mossi and Guilmanche kingdoms. These non-urban states, despite having, at least in the case of the Mossi, powerful armies, were characterized by settlement patterns of dispersed homesteads that moved on a regular basis, right? So the Moro Naba, the king of the Mossi, in the Middle Ages, he has this very large army that he can call up. He gets into all kinds of wars with the Songhai. But at the time of French colonization, he lives in a community of like 600 people, right? It's a very dispersed landscape. And so instead of having urban centers, instead you have very large households that are often a couple hundred meters or even a kilometer or so apart on the landscape. And I'm noting that these are fairly short-lived locations. I'm not suggesting that these are mobile people that are moving every year, right? This is more like moving every 10, 20, 30 years, but that creates a very shallow archaeological record, both literally shallow archaeological record. And the thing is that this type of extensive settlement is really difficult to study archaeologically, right? To get a fix on how these states were organized. And through a regional survey that I directed in the Gomnanga region of southeastern Burkina Faso, at the very edge of the territory controlled by the Guilmanche kingdoms, we were able to identify in a 75 square kilometer area over 500 previously unknown archaeological sites. And this is enabling us to gain potentially a little bit of insight into the development of these settlement patterns. Now, the Gomnanga escarpment, which you see on the right here, is an aquifer, so it's a permanent water source. And interestingly, so this region was originally studied by a German project in the late 1980s that went there because they thought they were going to find really early evidence of agriculture, and they didn't. And so they said, oh well, we're going to go somewhere else now. And what I found when I went there was it was actually really interesting because we do get settled agriculture relatively late in this location, potentially because it is such a rich microenvironment. The early agricultural sites, of which there aren't very many, you can see them on the map here, are isolated homesteads, but they're occupied for several hundred years. We have consecutive rebuildings in place, multiple refloorings within houses, and they seem to be generalized households, each of which has fairly unique pottery. Circa 1050 AD, there's a dramatic shift in the archaeological record, and we see the emergence of a new cultural landscape characterized, as you can see here, by hundreds of briefly occupied household sites. And you'll notice I've divided them into high and low confidence sites because these are really surface sites. They are this deep at most. They are incredibly difficult to date. We're really looking at a few places where we have stratigraphy and then extrapolating from that to a very, very large surface collecting program. And these households, which are likely occupied for a couple decades at most, are pretty small. Most of these sites are 15 to 20 meters in diameter. They're ceramic scatters, often with some groundstone tools, and they're extremely difficult to date precisely. Although interpreting the landscape is inhibited by the challenges we face in dating these sites, we do have evidence for economic integration. They share a really interesting complex ceramic assemblage that does everything that archaeologists are told their ceramics won't do. We're always told as archaeologists that types are fictional, that that material culture all kind of grades into other material culture. not the case in this region. In this region, they make, as you can see here, hourglass-shaped vessels that are made with grog-tempered paste and have a dragged comb decoration in heavy red slip. They make beaker-shaped vessels that are made out of a micaceous clay that have impressed cord decoration. They make flared vessels that are quartz tempered, that have impressed comb decoration. So there's these really interesting, and I could go on for quite a while on this, but they have these very interesting, very different types of pottery that maybe I'm guessing are likely made by different potters. We don't know that for certain. We don't know where the pottery is being made. But what we do see is we find all these different types at all of these sites. And so there's clearly some kind of interesting circulation going on that's binding these regions together. So even though the populations are fairly mobile, we still have some kind of greater community here. Now it is, and I would argue that it's possible, it's hard to say for certain, that this shift marks the emergence of the kind of dense, non-urban cultural landscape that is characteristic of the Masi and Guilmanche kingdoms. Now, unlike sites located closer to the Niger River, which is only 125 kilometers from the study region, my research in the Gobnangu found no evidence of imported trade goods during the medieval period. So this is something that is going on outside of these trade networks. So, both Curie Congo and Manag speak to the extraordinary diversity of cultural processes occurring in West Africa outside of trade networks with North Africa. But where does this leave us? Well, one, we have the Catalan Atlas, because I think there's like a contractual obligation that one cannot talk about West Africa in the Middle Ages without having the Catalan Atlas in your slideshow. It's got to do it. So where does this leave us? I think in some ways talking about when and how we should use the term medieval is a little bit of an ivory tower inside baseball kind of debate. However, I would argue that it does speak to broader questions of how we engage with global history and networks in a region in which the colonial denigration of history still looms large today. And just to give you a sense of how pervasive this is, in 2006, when I was in Burkina Faso doing my fieldwork, I had a conversation with a US Embassy employee who asked me what I was doing there. And I said I was there to do archaeology. And he said, why? What's there to find here? People here live as they have for thousands of years. And he got a very, very long response to that statement. I think he regretted it. But regardless of whether or not one chooses to use the term medieval, what I argue is most crucial is that our discussions of West Africa in the context of the medieval world, as we're expanding this medieval globe, to talk about West Africa, we need to be sure that we talk about all of West Africa, that we don't just talk about the parts that are mentioned in the Arabic sources or that are on the medieval trade routes, and that instead we recognize and incorporate the full breadth of the societies in the region. And here's just some of the acknowledgements, and especially Dr. Lucina Cote, who has facilitated all of my research in Burkina Faso. Thank you.
I have a mic.
Dr. Gallagher has graciously agreed to take questions, and I know who wants to ask the first one.
I loved your talk.
Oh, thank you.
I thought it was great. How do we know that the people in gravesite 3
Yeah.
originated in site 4?
Yeah, it's because each of those households is making their own pottery. And so we have unique household-based pottery styles. And so the pottery that we find in those grave sites is the same as the pottery from Mound 4. In addition, there are also continued subfloor household burials in the other mounds, and that practice ceases at Mound 4. So it's sort of two different lines of evidence that those are the dead.
Uh-huh.
Mound 4. And then one thing that's actually really interesting about the household styles is that the pottery from Mound 4 isn't actually the fanciest pottery. The fanciest pottery is actually at the second household. And we think, and Dubin has argued in a piece in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, that that the pottery at Mound, the second household, is actually more elaborate in part because part of creating inequality is increasing the senses of difference and household identity between these different households, right? Making them more separate and in a sense a little bit competitive with each other.
And is it possible, I was trying to think of any other possible explanation for the concentration of cattle. I mean, could there be some counterintuitive explanation? Oh, you know, everybody gets together and said, we'll be more efficient if all the cattle graze here or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think that, you know, I do have to be careful. We have to be careful when we're talking about the cattle that we, you know, as you said, is it that, like, that none of the other household have cattle anymore or have no longer access to cattle? But regardless, I think cattle is more under the control of Mound 4, whether it's that the grazing is happening there, whether it's that the consumption is happening there, it still is something that used to happen in other households that no longer happens in other households.
Okay, and finally, the Campbell guy.
Yeah.
And that ridiculous map.
Yes.
Did people take him or her to task
I haven't
for leaving Africa out of the world?
I haven't seen it mentioned in any of the reviews. Yeah, I don't know.
Fair, that's not his map.
What's it not? Whose map? Is that your map, Sean?
Janet Ebeling-Goods. It's from her book. So I mean, that's a map drawn from an older model of medieval globe that doesn't. So let's not tar Bruce with that particular brush.
I will say though is that on the one hand we don't want to try. I mean, it is an older map, but you could also add another circle.
Yeah, fair enough. You don't have to use that map.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. This is really provocative and fascinating. And to follow that line, and then I have a question. Jack Goody, also, who writes about the impact of Islam on Europe, also leaves out sub-Saharan Africa, and he is an Africanist working in Ghana. So there is this kind of historic, strange divide about somehow not wanting to see sub-Saharan Africa as contributing to Europe. So I have a couple of questions on the issue of cattle. I'm wondering at what point in Burkina Faso the Fulani are coming in and taking over the idea of control and pasturage for these herds. And I say this as somebody who's worked in a Grunchi-linked area in Togo where this happened. And then secondly, I had a couple of questions on Gene Geno, in particular, the idea that there was no complex architecture historically in Gene going back, and also the lack of intensive agriculture, and wondering, in terms of the architecture, whether we know we have a history of the destruction of the mosque at Gene for political and other reasons, and wondering if that could be part of a longer process of architectural destruction. And on the question of intensive agriculture, in Gene, you've got this incredibly rich surround with the Bani and Niger rivers, you've got fish, and then you've got trade. And so I've left you with a pile of questions. And I'm stunned by the rhino, I mean, not the rhino, but the hippos and the leopards and all of that, because there is a theory that large-scale elephant hunting, among other things, is leading to state formation.
Yeah. So, all right. So to take your questions one at a time. So first off, the Fulani. I wish we knew more about when the Fulani are coming in. I mean, we're talking, I don't think anyone's addressed it archaeologically. Of course, pastoralist sites are very difficult to pick up. There's, I think most of the historical and oral historical work puts the Fulani coming in several hundred years later. But of course, oral historical timelines are often telescoped, right, to be more recent. So not really certain of that. One thing I do think is interesting is that in phase 4, starting in 1400 AD, is when we first start to see pottery that has some of the same decorations as the inland Niger Delta. When we first start to see the Blepharis ceramic roulettes, for example, And so we do definitely see new populations. We think in that case it's probably Jula traders, right, that are starting to move into the region. Mande speakers, Jula live in the region today. So that process, at least, our evidence suggests is happening later. In terms of the Fulani, yeah, it's hard to say. We have done a regional survey that we haven't published yet. And in that regional survey, we didn't find any evidence of pastoralist sites. But again, they'd be ephemeral and they'd be hard to pick up. Second, on the thing of Jenny Janot architecture. So the Jenny Janot architecture is one of those topics, right? Because their largest excavation units at the peak of the mound were a paired set of, I believe there's 6x4s or 5x5 meters, right? So we don't have very large spatial exposures, and we just have little sort of telescope, tiny insights. And in those little spaces, they didn't find any large buildings like, Cisse has found at Gao Ancien. And so because of this, Susan and Rod have argued that we don't necessarily have monumental architecture. Now, the Jenny Ferry bricks, the round Jenny Ferry bricks, those come in at about 700 AD. And when they come in, they're in circular structures. Now, in the excavations at Jenny proper, at the Jenny Museum site right next to the mosque, there they have the Jenny bricks from the beginning, and actually in about the 1800s, in that sequence, the walls get a lot wider, and they've suggested that might be when we start to get second-story architecture, which would put two-story architecture at Jenny, which we consider so classic as part of the Jenny style, something that's coming in as late as the 1800s, right? So, but again, we're talking in that case about one 6x6 excavation unit. And so that's always a challenge when we're talking about this architecture that, Kevin McDonald has frequently commented on on this question of whether we can say there's no monumental architecture at Jenny. He has argued that the spatial exposures are not big enough to make that claim. And I think Susan's response is, how many excavation units do I need to dig without finding monumental architecture before people will agree that it's not there? In regards to the intensification of agriculture, there, I think it is a really interesting question. In the Middle Senegal Valley, we were able to identify that the sequence there ends at about 1100 AD, and we don't have intensive agriculture there because we don't yet see dual cropping, right? In the inland Niger Delta, I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult. The 1981 botanical analysis, though, was all presence absence, and it was presence absence, and it includes a lot of stuff in the things, those samples have been lost, but there's a lot in there that I strongly suspect was not carbonized and may have been intrusive just because they get very specific. Jack Carlin did some of the analyses, and he got very specific on his wild grass species. And with carbonized wild grasses, to have the bloom preservation, you would need to do that. It would be really weird. And so I'm not sure, I think once we get into the sample, also at UC London, Dorian Fuller has recently figured out some ways to identify rice spikelet bases, and especially domestic rice spikelet bases. And those haven't been looked for in Jenny Janot samples previously, so maybe getting some of that chaff will help us get there as well. And then finally, Jiboy, right? With Jiboy and the hunting practices there, it is really, I think, a phenomenally interesting site that we're kind of just beginning to get the sense of. It is a very small community. The site is not very large, and I do think that, but it has, there's actually more trade goods at Jiboy than there is at Jenny Janot, which tells you how little we found in terms of trade goods at Jenny Janot. But I do think there's a lot to be sort of sorted out in terms of what they're hunting, why they're hunting, and how it fits into especially Greater Mande, right? And Greater Mande practices.
Hi, thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. And I'm afraid my question might actually be a little tangential to the point you were trying to make.
I love tangents.
But so you use the term like Arabic texts.
Yeah.
and it seemed to be quite loosely as though they were outside sources. And I'm wondering where kind of the Timbuktu libraries or the Nouakchott libraries or even Arabic scripted Hausa or like other forms of Arabic scripted kind of local languages fit into what you're saying.
So pretty much, at least as of right now, and I mean, someone can correct me on this if I'm wrong, there are virtually all of the manuscripts in those libraries are from after 1500. So some of them, like the Tariq al-Sudan, talk about these earlier periods, but when I was referring to the Arabic external sources, I was mostly referring to those that were written during the medieval period to 1500, all of which, as far as I know, are from North Africa, right? Al-Bakri, Al-Mari, all of those people. So yeah, I mean, I was a little bit loose with it there, but in referring to Arabic external sources, I was specifically referencing those texts that were being written during the medieval period, rather than, yes, the very large corpus in local languages, in the Timbuktu libraries, in the Nouakchott libraries, and so on. But yeah, that assemblage is for the most part. And I'd say also, I mean, mention Michael Gomez's Coming to Speak, right? His new book, African Dominion, is just like a really much needed, incredible rereading of those texts and rewriting of those narratives. And so, yeah.
I have a quick question for you about, it goes back to the hunting. I love the hippo hunting.
Yeah.
But
You know,
about,
John Rauch has ethnographic film of hippo hunting in the 1940s.
oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
So the question I had, and this is, I don't know how we answer this question when we're dealing mostly with archaeological evidence, because the period I work on, although contemporary, there's a lot of text, but I'm in medieval Europe, but I'm interested in how hunting articulates within sociopolitics, because one of the problems, of course, with hunting in the early Middle Ages is that it performs this sort of fluid role. It's economic, but it's also political, but it's also social. It's an aristocratic activity. It's leisure, and yet it has these economic, sort of, it flows over into economy, like the collection of skins and the collection of trophies and all these things, and meat. And how exactly, I'm curious about how in Africa, what do we know, or what can we extrapolate about the role that it might play, especially in sociopolitics, because I think that's an interesting question. Like, why is all this going on, and how is that a performance of power, for instance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's, you know, it'll be really interesting to see how this shakes out, because of course hunters have these very important social roles. The Epic of Sunjata, which describes the history and the foundation of the Malian Empire, is about Sunjata, who's a hunter who defeats the evil, Sumaworo, the evil Soso blacksmith king, right? And so you have this sort of tension between the hunters and the blacksmiths in the foundation of the Empire of Mali, right? And so then Sunjata, the initial, original Mansa, is a hunter. So there is definitely this association of hunting with political power. Hunters in Mande culture, there's there's like hunter shirts that have gree and special terms on them. So hunting definitely has these really significant social and ritual associations that we can't minimize. Now the question for Jibwe, I think, that is going to be really tough to figure out is going to be this question of how this really different hunting profile that is at this much higher volume articulates within, right? Is this a place of people that are particularly prestigious because they're hunting, or is this a place, and they're not just hunting anything, right? They're hunting very dangerous things like hippos. They're hunting extremely prestigious things like leopards, right? So I think, is it that these people have a special status, or is it something where it's become sort of an economic production? And really what we need more archaeological research to figure out, and to see how Jibwe compares to, if we could excavate, if we got excavations and data from other sites, such that we would have some more counterpoints to Jibwe that are sort of outside, more on the fringes of the Mande, of the Mali Empire, to compare it to. I think it would be really exciting.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. I fully take your point that using medieval to refer to West African sites that have connections with Islamic North Africa or with North Africa, and not using it for bits of West Africa that don't show those traces. I assume the biggest problem with that is that it sort of makes a kind of artificial cut down the middle of an area which is otherwise showing connections with each other, or is showing a sort of a unified sense of something, right? But I wondered then, what are those connections between the North African influence sites and the non-North African influence sites if they're not trade network connections?
So the thing is that it's difficult because there are certain, among those sites that are part of those North African trade networks, those trade networks then spread down into the forest zone, right? And include, I mean, we find beads from Ile-Ife all over sites. Now, the sites in Burkina Faso are a little bit more challenging because since we don't have much in the way of goods that we can closely track, it's hard to draw the connections, and we're also hampered by the fact that we are still at this site-to-site comparison, right? That we're not able to, for example, if you're working in the American Southwest, you can tell exactly which pueblo every single piece of pottery in your site was made at just from its design and decoration. And so you can capture those networks and trade networks of local goods a little bit more easily. In West Africa, we're not really there yet because those more local trade networks like, for Jenny to know, the smoked fish and the iron and so on are a little bit harder to track archaeologically. I think it's more about the fact that I would rather assume that those networks are there than assume that they're not there, if that makes sense. I think that because of the way these particular set of North African trade goods, the glass, the copper, really sort of pop in the archaeological record, they preserve really well. We can see them, you find a glass bead, even though some of those things do come from, especially Yoruba region sites. When we find those, I think it's very easy to focus on them, right? Especially now that we can put a little, pop it into a machine, do an analysis, and figure out exactly where that bead was made, or exactly where that copper is from. And so I think we get really hyper-focused on those trade networks and on that portion of the archaeology. And drawing the connections between the sites further south is a little bit more complicated because we don't have the text to rely on, and we don't have, at least so far, these same kinds of things that will just pop. Now, one thing I think that does show that these networks are there is the fact that we'll have the Jula traders that move out from the Empire of Mali as the Empire of Mali disintegrates, and they bring really distinctive pottery with them, but also when tobacco hits West Africa, you get these little clay tobacco pipes that are made they're locally made, but they're really different from previous pottery in a lot of interesting ways. They're made via a carved method. They're highly decorated, and tobacco pipes spread like wildfire across West Africa. It's like this 1600 AD horizon of pipes that is just everywhere. And I think the speed with which the tobacco pipes spread shows us that, and those tobacco pipes spread to everywhere. They're not solely, they're not like the earlier trade stuff, right? They are everywhere. And so I think that shows us that these connections, at least, these connections are there in 1600 when you get tobacco with the pipes. And so once, I feel like that's, not a new network. I think those are a sudden visibility of a network that already existed.
Great, thank you. I'm in one of these sunken chairs. That was a wonderful talk, and I really learned a lot. I had a question, kind of on the broad level, since of these newer sites that you're working in, Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire. To what degree the settlement patterns? Because you talked about some of the villages based along a river basin, or water basin.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you guys are being able to tell about settlement distribution in relationship to things like water sources. Are the villages where you would expect them to be with access to water? Or I know one of the really interesting things about the work along the Niger River is that sometimes the settlements aren't where we expect them to be, right? Because perhaps there's sacred landscapes that don't align with water sources, things like that. So I'm just wondering on a global scale, what sort of patterns you're starting to tease out.
Yeah. So first, let me qualify this with the fact that I don't think we have good enough coverage anywhere to really talk very authoritatively about patterns. We do see some things that we expect. So for example, in the Mahun Bend region, where Curie Congo is, that's an area where river blindness has historically been a big issue, and you don't find any settlements within, about a kilometer or two of the water, right? They're all close enough to the river that you can easily get to the river, but they're not right on the river, right? And that's probably because of the river blindness as a factor. I haven't encountered anything, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head where we have a big enough sort of spread to, say, identify sacred landscapes or things like that. I mean, at this stage, so few archaeological sites, at this stage, I can't think of a case study where someone's gone looking for archaeological sites in West Africa and not found them, if that makes sense, period. Like, there's just, there's so much, there's so many. And I don't feel like I have a very good answer to that question. I wish I did. I wish we were. I wish we could sit here and talk about that. But yeah, for the most part, anywhere you look that you think there might be archaeological sites, you pretty much find them. So, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm particularly interested in, as not an Africanist, in your historiographic argument or your terminological argument, I suppose. And I think the point you made that Anna picked up a couple of minutes ago about how if some sites are going to be medieval, then all sites have to be medieval is very interesting and provoking. So within medieval studies considered as a European discipline, is it still quite largely, as exclusively was until quite recently, the discussions, at least around here, over the last 15 years have been about whether one can move from a European conception of the Middle Ages to a global one, whatever global would mean, or whether, in fact, one's looking at a kind of large regional thing in order to maintain some sort of sense of cultural coherence. And so trade is a huge matter there, and so are kind of intellectual networks. And from the point of view of European medievalists, part of the initial intention was actually to decenter the medieval Europe from the medieval. Yeah. But we run quickly into problems of center margin as that happens, and that's one of the seductions of the global, is there's no longer a margin. Right. It's all apparently central. But you've actually introduced another interesting distinction where if we took the medieval as global or didn't worry about the fact that Southwest Africa was on the margin of some regional thing, we didn't worry about that. We'd still have to worry about the local. So medieval becomes the global term, and we have to worry about the local instead. And I think that's very important, and that's very important within global. The whole idea of global studies is that places that don't fit into global networks. I'm interested in what you're really saying in response to that so far is that we just don't have the information yet, but we need to keep. And by local, I mean places that are not medieval according to this trade, North African trade route thing, but they need to be, so that's medieval one would be places that trade with places we know to have been medieval or think of as medieval. Medieval two would be places that we don't know about yet. Yeah. Or that, yes.
Yeah, and so, also places that we like, trade is only one way to integrate, right? We could also be thinking about religious and ritual practices and the ways in which they overlap. We could be thinking about, we have a lot of environmental networks and environmental processes that are going on in terms of, aside from production of commodities, right? Things like shea butter, things like iron, and so on. So I think there is this question of trade, but I think we also have to be careful that just because we can't establish a trade route between two given places in West Africa, if they are only 200 miles apart, chances are there's some kind of social interaction going on. And so I think, we just need to be thinking really broadly.
Is there a way around that's like an epidemiological model of medieval, isn't it? I mean, that it's something being passed down like a disease. Yeah. I keep finding myself drawn back to like medieval as a heuristic, or maybe as something, to be old-fashioned, a sort of Marxist model of medieval in the sense that it's about a certain kind of mode of production or a certain relationship of producers and product and modes of power and the exercise of them that can be found to be somewhat durable depending on sort of like material conditions that are in various sorts of places. I think people have left that behind, and it goes back in a sense to the sort of like a conflation of the pre-modern and the Iron Age models. But I don't know whether it still has any legs, because it seems like if we go away from the epidemiological model, then I'm not sure where we're at. Because in other words, it's that, you know, if the medieval is the global, I don't think it's actually that everything's a center. It's like everything's a periphery in the global Middle Ages model that we're pursuing now. Like everything's now a margin. And I'm not sure, it just seems to be changing the terms of the debate or moving the deck chairs. I'm not sure where we get with that.
Well, I guess the question is, does the terminology that if we want to talk about like the globe at a certain period of time, right, and the different ways in which the globe at a certain period of time interacts with each other, and we want to have an easy, handy way to ensure that we're all talking about the same time, such that we don't have to spell out our dates. And also as archaeologists, we sometimes don't like to spell out our dates because our dates are very fuzzy on the edges. You know, so you're like 6th to 7th to 14th to 16th, right? You know, it gets very clunky in your writing. And so, I mean, I guess it's the question of, does it have to have an intellectual, or like, you know, as you're saying, like you're pointing to like a Marxist model, right? Does it have to have some kind of broader significance, or can we just say, okay, medieval is like this period, we all acknowledge that it has this European history, yeah, but it's like, but it's still it's useful and it enables us to talk to each other, much in the same way that one could argue the calendar does, right? That we are all kind of commonly using. It's 2018, and that has its own very culturally specific base, but yet regardless of where in the world you are, in most places, that has become, at least in academic writing, the standard. I mean, there's people who try actively to break that up. I know in Michael Gomez's African Dominion book, he makes a point of always including both the Arabic world dates and the Christian calendar dates, to emphasize the world in which he's writing. But I mean, that's a case of something that has been kind of divorced from its sort of original intellectual significance and instead become more of a scientific communication tool.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank our speaker. And